Hello, everybody. Francois Ward here. I'm a software engineering manager, and this is part two of a retrospective where we're looking at how much truth there is to the memes around how chaotic the front end ecosystem is, how much it actually changed, and if it's true that you have to be upgrading to the latest and greatest of new frameworks every other week. Now, for those just joining us, there's a link below to the blog post in question. It's a blog post I wrote in 2016 with what I thought at the time was the state of the art of JavaScript. Now we're going to be using the hindsights that we have in 2021 and see just how much changed. In this second part, we're going to be looking at isomorphic JavaScript or server-side rendering. We're going to be digging in the CSS ecosystem, especially CSS and JavaScript. And we're also going to do a slight detour and look at how much changed when it comes to accessing your data from the server. Now, once again, a warning. These videos are extremely subjective. Most of what you're going to be hearing is my own personal opinions, and your experience might differ from that. We're going to be covering a lot of technologies, and I can't be an expert on everything. So if I got anything wrong, please let me know, comment below, and tell us how your experience might differ. With that said, let's jump right through it. We have a lot to cover. All right, so first topic for today, isomorphic JavaScript or server-side rendering. So the first thing you'll notice here is the terminology. There used to be a lot of debates around just how to talk about it, how to call it. Some people were pushing to call it isomorphic JavaScript, which was one of the earlier terms. Then others came in and said, no, it should be universal JavaScript because isomorphic doesn't really say what we're trying to mean. There was also discussions around should we just talk about client-side and server-side JavaScript, or should we bundle in all the different platform JavaScripts can be running on, like mobile, like React Native, or just speak about server-side rendering? Well, in my experience lately, we don't hear a lot of these terms anymore. It's just server-side rendering. Um, Part of the reason is that that field matured a lot. There was a lot of development around it. It's a much more understood problem space, but it's also quite deep and quite complex. So it kind of deserved its own name. So where were we in 2016? React worked really well on the server. It allowed you to make your components, to build your components and render them in Node again on the server. On the other hand, you were still on your own to build your own server-side rendering solution with all the bells and whistle, make it performant, make sure it has all the proper monitoring, error handling, and that is just as a good developer experience to build an entire application this way. Next.js did not exist yet. It came out later in the year. Popular static site generators like Gatsby only came out in 2017. Static web apps themselves were not completely mainstream in my experience. They were sometimes even a bit controversial. At the time, most web apps, at least I found, were still built using more classic server-side languages like Ruby with Ruby on Rails, Python, Java, .NET. People would render a normal HTML page and enhance the experience with a JavaScript framework on top. But the idea of running JavaScript on the server, that was still somewhat exotic. The technique of being able to reuse your code in both environments was still pretty scary to some folks. So with that in mind, my recommendations at the time were not around the tools or a framework really, but it was to take a step back and think about if you really need server-side rendering. It was an exciting idea, but it was difficult. The main benefits of SSR are things like SEO, making your page easier to find on search engines like Google, but also it has some interesting performance characteristics, especially when it comes to mobile. So generally, I felt like SSR was better suited for apps like e-commerce websites. But if you build like an application behind a login screen that's more like like an actual app than a website, or if you build internal web apps, internal tools that don't really need to be discoverable, then it might not be worth it. Something extremely important that's often underestimated is just how hard it is to run Node on the server. Yeah, almost any qualified engineer can take a Node server, put it on a VM or whatever, and run it, and it's going to work. But when things start going wrong, when you have a performance issue, when you have a memory leak, the tooling to debug that is nowhere as mature, as advanced as what we have in the JVM or the CLR world. You shouldn't be doing SSR just because it sounds sexy or cool. With that said, all the challenges with Node on the server could be a video in themselves. Today, in 2021, things are a lot better and a lot easier. I said earlier that in 2016, things like Next.js did not exist. Well, today, not only they exist, but they're pretty mature, fairly popular, and they work really well. Next.js not only lets you do fully dynamic server-side rendering, but it also lets you do things like statically building your assets. This is really interesting to me because you can kind of get your cake and eat it too. You can build an app that you'd like to be server side rendered, but you render it at build time instead, still get a bunch of static assets, HTML pages, and then you drop them in a bucket, an S3 bucket, a GCS bucket, and you point your CDN, your content delivery network, in front of it, and you don't need an active server serving request, but your pages are still fast, still very mobile friendly, SEO friendly. And then when you do need something completely dynamic because there's too many permutations, you can do fully dynamic server rendering. So what's the verdict with the onset of 2021? Well, the whole realm of server-side rendering is kind of a world apart. It's much more powerful, much better understood. You're no longer on your own to build the entire thing from scratch. With that said, the whole point of how much harder and how much costly it is to maintain Node servers still stands. Whenever you start a new project, you and your team should still take a step back and ask yourself, do you need it? Don't just do server rendering because it's faster. Yeah, you always want your applications to be faster, and it's always better for your customers. However, what's better for your customers is having the time to build the features that they need. You might even come up ahead in terms of performance if you're not fighting with server-side issues all the time and can truly optimize your client-side code. Thus, my recommendation is not to go one way to or the other, but it's just not to blindly do it one way because you feel it's universally better. CSS and styling. Now we're getting spicy. A lot of folks have really strong opinions there. So let's put this out of the way. A big part of the evolution of the CSS ecosystem comes down to one thing: people don't like it and they don't want to have to learn it. JavaScript tooling and the development experience has evolved a lot faster than that of the CSS world. Because of that, there's a big push to make CSS work in a way that let us leverage these more advanced JS tools to be able to use ESLint, to be able to use all the bells and whistles of things like Webpack when it comes to CSS. In 2016, there was a lot of proofs of concept or up and coming frameworks for CSS and JS, especially with React, where it was a little bit easier to do. Anybody remember tools like Radium? At the same time, CSS preprocessors like Less, like Sass, like PostCSS were still going really strong. I personally felt that Less was really cool because it was built in JavaScript. It was pretty simple, but in the end, it kind of fell out of favor in favor of SAS, which was really popular, especially in the Ruby community. And people just felt it had more features, it was easier to use. In the end, there was a version built for Node SAS, which was built in C, that had the benefit of it being really, really fast. But on the other hand, I find that native packages like Node SAS cause a lot of issues when it comes to the infrastructure. There were other tools that were promising, like CSS modules, but in my experience at the time, they were really slow. An application that built in 5 minutes, all of a sudden built in like 30. And so my favorite tool at the time was Post CSS. It was unopinionated, it was built in JavaScript, it allowed you to use a ton of plugins, including some that let you use most of the feature of SAS, but you also could customize your environment however you wanted. So you were kind of a bit more future proof. So, how are things in 2021? There's a bunch of fairly popular CSS and JS solutions, especially tools like style components, like emotions, which work reasonably well. With that said, I've worked at a couple of companies that try to adopt style components, mainly because it seems to be the state of the art. But in practice, there's a lot of edge cases. Things like right to left support can be confusing or more complicated. And while at first it seems like it makes things a lot easier, you can tie your JavaScript to your components, you can do code splitting a lot easier. Um, all the extra complexity and nuances that it had over just plain vanilla CSS tend to confuse people more often than not. If you're using Vue.js, you kind of get an alternative for free since their components lets you use vanilla CSS and co-locate them with your components. But all around, I didn't see CSS and JS really solving the problems that they seem to solve on paper, and the cost is not outweighed by the benefits. More interestingly, we see other approaches to CSS that seem to be much more successful. There are CSS framework like Tailwind that let you get started, which what is essentially vanilla CSS, but in a much more structured way. Design systems, the practice of building something akin to a component library along with strong design guideline, is also becoming an industry standard. The interesting part of that is that it means front-end developers don't have to write CSS nearly that much. Maybe it's because they're using a third-party design system like an implementation of Material UI, which is becoming really popular. Or maybe it's because at their company there is a team that's building an internal design system. So my verdict in 2021, with the benefit of hindsight, in my opinion, and I might take some hate for that, but if you avoided CSS and JS, you kind of dodged a bullet. Many people are doing it successfully, at least from what I see on social media and the community, but it has definitely not been my experience. If you went with something like Post CSS, well, the flexibility ensured you were future proof. And then there's design systems, which just change how much CSS you have to write and kind of make part of the problem just go away or be irrelevant. And so that's the way I'd go if I started a new application today. Either Tailwind, either a design system, either built in house or something like Material UI. Okay, this topic feels almost silly today. Like putting too much thought into how we do HTTP requests and fetch data from the server, it's just not that big of a deal these days. But when you go back a couple of years, the Fetch API, especially natively to browsers, was kind of new. It came out in like the 2014, 2015 range, and it definitely did not work in Internet Explorer. People didn't really know about the polyfills, and a lot of folks were still using jQuery to do HTTP requests if they were not using a framework like Angular. Still, there were things I did not consider, at the time when I wrote the blog post, namely that fetch was missing features that XmlHttp request had. The most important one was request cancellation. So where it really matters is for use cases like if you have an autocomplete dropdown that fetch data from the server. As your user is typing, you're firing a bunch of requests, and most of them become obsolete as the user keep typing. So generally, you want to cancel the request, but you just couldn't. It took a few more years and a couple of proposals before a solution came to be with Fetch, because Fetch is built on promises, and promises are not cancelable. They eventually came out with the abort controller, which kind of solved the problem. What I found though is that for teams that used Fetch, since they couldn't cancel requests, they just kind of forgot about it, and they got into the bad habit of never doing it, and their user experience suffered. I find that while it's cool to be able to use a native browser API with no libraries, almost every team I work with inevitably start wrapping their HTTP client, build abstractions on top of it, or use a third-party library like Axios. On top of that, if you made the jump to GraphQL, you might be using a framework like Apollo or like Relay. So my verdict in 2021, to be honest, I feel this is a category where I was completely wrong. Being able to cancel requests was actually pretty important. The benefit of using something cool, shiny, and new like Fetch really did not outweigh the cost. But if you use Fetch back then and your team started writing suboptimal codes to be able to use a sexier API, well, I was wrong. I'm sorry. Whatever you do, just don't bring jQuery back just to do HTTP requests. And this is it for the second part of the retrospective. This time around, we discuss a few more spicier topic like SSR and the state of CSS. So let me know, how is that working out for you? Are you doing something completely different than what I suggested? Or do you disagree with some of my opinions? In the next installment, we'll be touching even more controversial topics, such as unit testing. We're also going to be looking at utility libraries, but also one of the most popular topic of discussions, build tooling. And on that note, thank you for watching and see you in the next one.